I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. Ghost stories, haunted houses, and eerie coincidences were things I enjoyed for the thrill, but I never believed in them. That was until one weekend changed everything. It was a late autumn evening when my friends and I decided to take a road trip to an old cabin in the woods. We had heard rumors about the place that it was haunted, that strange things happened there, but we brushed it off as just local folklore. None of us believed in that sort of thing, and we were looking forward to a relaxing weekend away from the stresses of daily life. The cabin belonged to Matt's uncle, who hadn't visited it in years. It was isolated, nestled deep in the forest, and had no modern amenities. No electricity, no cell service, just the four of us, the stars, and the woods. It sounded like the perfect getaway. We arrived at the cabin just before dusk. The place was exactly what you'd expect from an old, forgotten cabin: weathered wood, a creaky front porch, and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in decades. Inside, it was even more rustic, with a stone fireplace, old wooden furniture, and a musty smell that lingered in the air. But despite its eerie appearance, we were excited. The cabin had a certain charm, and we quickly got to work setting up our sleeping bags and lighting the old kerosene lamps. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and we huddled around the fireplace, sharing stories and laughing. The woods outside were completely silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. There was something unsettling about the quietness, but none of us mentioned it. Instead, we focused on enjoying each other's company. Around midnight, we decided to turn in for the night. The cabin had only two small bedrooms, so we paired up, Matt and I in one room, and Sarah and Jake in the other. As I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The quiet of the forest outside seemed too unnatural. I tried to ignore it and closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep. At some point in the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor. My heart raced as I strained to listen. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving from the living room towards our bedroom. I held my breath, my mind racing with possibilities. Could it be Matt getting up to use the bathroom? But the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. I glanced over at Matt, who was still sound asleep. The footsteps stopped just outside our door. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up as I stared at the door, waiting for anything to happen. But after a few moments of silence, the footsteps retreated, moving back towards the living room. I was too terrified to move. Every rational part of me wanted to believe it was just the house settling, or perhaps an animal outside, but the sound had been so clear, so distinct. I lay there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest, until exhaustion finally overtook me and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy, but didn't mention the incident to anyone. As we gathered in the kitchen for breakfast, I noticed Sarah seemed unusually quiet. After a bit of prodding, she finally spoke up. "Did any of you hear someone walking around last night?" She asked hesitantly. My blood ran cold. "You heard it too?" Sarah nodded, her face pale. "I thought I was dreaming, but it felt so real. I heard footsteps right outside our door. I was too scared to check, so just stayed in bed." Jake chimed in, looking concerned. "I heard them too. I even got up to see if someone was outside, but when I opened the door, there was no one there." We all exchanged uneasy glances. Matt, the most skeptical of us all, tried to brush it off. "It's an old cabin, probably just the wood creaking or something. Let's not freak ourselves out." But the tension in the room was palpable. None of us could shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the mood had shifted. We no longer felt the excitement we had when we first arrived. Instead, there was a lingering sense of dread that none of us could explain. That night, we decided to sleep in the same room. We pushed the beds together, creating a makeshift sleeping area where we could all be close. It was a tight fit, but none of us wanted to be alone after the previous night's experience. We extinguished the lamps and lay in the darkness, listening to the crackling of the dying fire in the hearth. The cabin was silent again, but this time, the silence felt oppressive, like the air was thick with something unseen. It must have been around 2 a.m. when the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing back and forth in the living room. We all heard it. I could feel Sarah trembling beside me, and Jake's breathing quickened in fear. No one dared to move. The footsteps grew closer, moving towards our room, then stopped abruptly. My heart was in my throat. We were all wide awake, paralyzed with fear. The door creaked slightly, as if something was pressing against it, testing it. We waited, not daring to breathe. But then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps retreated again. We heard them fade into the distance, eventually disappearing altogether. The silence that followed was deafening. None of us slept that night. We stayed huddled together, waiting for the first light of dawn. As soon as the sun began to rise, we packed up our things and left the cabin, not even bothering to eat breakfast. The drive back was quiet. We were all trying to process what had happened, but none of us could find the words. It wasn't until we were back in the safety of our apartment that we finally talked about it. We shared our experiences, realizing that whatever had been in that cabin had been real, and it had been watching us. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. We never returned to that cabin, and we never spoke of the incident again. But every now and then, I find myself lying awake at night, listening for the sound of footsteps outside my door, and wondering what might be waiting to us beyond the darkness. It's strange, but the fear I felt in that cabin hasn't left me. Even now, safe in my own bed, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known again. I'm not the type who usually shares ghost stories or claims to have experienced the paranormal. I'm a rational person, grounded in reality, and I've always found comfort in the explainable. But there's one night, one experience, that I can't easily explain away. It's a story I don't tell often, but when I do, it still sends chills down my spine. It happened about 5 years ago. I was driving home from a weekend visit to my parents' house, which is about a 4-hour drive from where I live. I had stayed later than I intended, and by the time I left, it was already past 10 p.m. I wasn't too worried. There was a stretch of highway that was usually deserted at that hour, and I figured I could make good time without much traffic. The first 2 hours were uneventful. The road was empty, save for the occasional truck rumbling by. My only company was the hum of my car engine and the faint static from the radio. It was just past midnight when I reached a more remote part of the highway, a long stretch surrounded by dense woods on either side. This was the part of the drive I always found a little unsettling, especially at night. The trees seemed to close in, their branches forming a dark canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The road ahead was a black ribbon, winding through the forest. I was starting to feel the fatigue of the day, my eyelids heavy as I drove through the inky darkness. I decided to turn off the radio, thinking the silence might help me focus, but almost immediately, I regretted it. Without the distraction of the music, I became acutely aware of how isolated I was. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional thud of a bump in the road. Then, as I rounded a curve, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. Up ahead, in the middle of the road, was a figure. I slowed down, squinting to see more clearly. It was a woman, standing perfectly still, facing my car. She was wearing a long, white dress that looked almost old-fashioned, like something out of another era. Her hair was long and dark, hanging loosely around her shoulders. I brought the car to a stop, a few yards away from her. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. What was she doing out here in the middle of nowhere? Was she hurt? I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. Every instinct told me to stay in the car, but I couldn't just leave her there. Before I could make a decision, the woman slowly turned and walked off the road, disappearing into the trees. I watched her go, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't until she was completely out of sight that I realized how tightly I'd been gripping the steering wheel. I sat there for a few moments, the car idling, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I was debating whether to follow her or keep driving when I noticed something in my rearview mirror, a faint, flickering light coming from the woods behind me. I twisted around in my seat, straining to see where it was coming from. It looked like a lantern, bobbing slightly as it moved through the trees. I could just make out a figure holding it, but the darkness made it impossible to tell if it was the same woman or someone else. My skin prickled with a sense of dread. This wasn't right. Something about the situation felt deeply, inherently wrong. I shifted the car into gear, ready to leave, when the light suddenly went out. The woods plunged back into darkness, and the sense of foreboding intensified. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I knew I needed to get out of there. I pressed down on the gas, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. The car lurched forward, and I sped away, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that light again or the figure of the woman stepping back onto the road. But there was nothing, just the empty highway stretching out behind me. As I drove, my mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I really seen someone? Maybe it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly avoided something terrible. The rest of the drive passed in a blur. I kept the car at a steady speed, unwilling to slow down, unwilling to let the darkness catch up to me. When I finally reached the outskirts of my town, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I pulled into my driveway, just as the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. I sat there for a long time, the engine still running, trying to calm my racing heart. I kept replaying the night in my mind, but every time I did, I felt that same chill of fear. I couldn't shake the image of that woman, standing so still in the middle of the road, or the light that had followed me into the night. For weeks after, I couldn't bring myself to drive that stretch of highway again. Even now, I avoid it if I can. I never told anyone about what happened, not really. How could I explain something that I don't fully understand myself? But I can tell you this, there are things out there, on the dark roads, in the places where the world feels thin. And sometimes, just sometimes, you come too close to them. So, if you're ever driving alone at night and you find yourself on a lonely road, remember this story. Keep your eyes on the road, your mind sharp, and whatever you do, don't stop. Not for anything, because sometimes, the things you see in the dark are real, and they're waiting. When I was a kid, my family owned a small cabin in the mountains. It was an old, creaky place, passed down through generations, and we spent nearly every summer there. I loved it, despite its age and the strange noises it made at night. There was something comforting about being so far from the rest of the world, surrounded by trees and the constant whisper of the wind through the pines. But there was one summer, one night in particular, that I've never been able to forget. It happened when I was around 12 years old. My parents, my older brother Jack, and I had arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. As always, we spent the first day settling in and packing, cleaning up the dust that always seemed to accumulate no matter how tightly we closed the windows, and exploring the woods. By the time night fell, we were exhausted, and at the quick dinner, we all went to bed early. The cabin had two small bedrooms, one for my parents and one for Jack and me. Our room had a large window that looked out into the forest, and I always found it a little eerie at night, the way the darkness seemed to press right up against the glass, but I was used to it. We had been coming to this cabin for years, and I'd never had any reason to be afraid. That night, though, something felt different. I remember waking up in the middle of the night. The wind was howling outside, louder than I'd ever heard it before. It rattled the window, oh hard that I half expected it to shatter. Jack was still asleep, snoring softly in the bed next to mine. I rolled over, trying to go back to sleep, but something about the wind kept me awake. It wasn't just the noise, it was the way it sounded, almost like it was speaking. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the wind and the trees. But the longer I lay there, the more convinced I became that there was something else out there. I couldn't make out any words, but there was a rhythm to the sound, a low, murmuring tone that seemed to deliver to be natural. Curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Jack, and crept over to the window. The forest outside was pitch black, the trees swaying violently in the wind. I squinted, trying to see if there was anything out there, but all I could make out were vague shapes and shadows. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw something. A flicker of movement, deeper in the woods, where the light from the cabin didn't reach. I pressed my face closer to the glass, trying to get a better look. It was hard to see, but there was definitely something out there, something tall and thin, moving slowly between the trees. My heart started to pound. I wanted to believe it was just a trick of the light, maybe a tree branch swaying in the wind, But the more I watched, the more certain I became that it was a figure. It was too tall to be a person, its limbs too long and spindly. It moved with a strange, jerky motion, almost like it was struggling to stay upright. I must have been staring for a good minute, my breath fogging up the glass. When the figure suddenly stopped, I froze, my blood turning to ice. It was standing still now, as if it knew I was watching. Then, slowly, it turned. I couldn't see its face if it even had one, but I knew, without a doubt, that it was looking right at me. That I stumbled back from the window, my heart in my throat. I wanted to wake Jack, to tell him what I'd seen, but I was too scared to make a sound. Instead, I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the window, half expecting to see the figure coming closer. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching, waiting. The wind outside picked up again, howling even louder, and with it came that same whispering sound. It was clearer now, almost like a voice, but still, just out of reach, like it was speaking a language I couldn't understand. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, listening to that strange, unintelligible murmur. It felt like hours, but it could have been just a few minutes. All I knew was that I needed to get away from that window. I finally found the courage to move, inching back towards my bed. I climbed under the covers, pulling them up to my chin, and squeezed my eyes shut. I wanted to believe that if I couldn't see it, it couldn't see me. But even with my eyes closed, I could still feel its gaze, cold and unblinking. I lay there, trembling, for what felt like forever. The whispering didn't stop, but eventually, I must have drifted off to sleep from sheer exhaustion, because the next thing I remember is waking up to daylight streaming through the window. The first thing I did was look outside. The woods were calm, peaceful even, with no sign of the strange figure I had seen the night before. But the unease from the night lingered, and I knew what I had experienced wasn't just a dream. At breakfast, I was too shaken to mention anything to my family, but Jack seemed on edge too. He kept glancing out the window, his brow furrowed. Finally, I asked him if he had heard anything strange last night. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Double quotes, yeah, he said quietly. I thought I heard voices, but when I woke up, I didn't see anything. Just the wind, I guess. We didn't talk about it any further, and we never mentioned it to our parents. But that day, both Jack and I stayed close to the cabin, reluctant to venture too far into the woods. The wind had died down. The forest was quiet again, but the memory of that night stayed with us. We left the cabin a few days later, and for years, I tried to convince myself that what I had seen was just a trick of the light, a product of my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew better. There was something out there that night, something that shouldn't have been, and it had seen me. To this day, I don't know what it was, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that I've never felt comfortable in the woods at night since, and every time the wind starts to whisper, I can't help but wonder if it's trying to tell me something, or if it's just waiting for me to listen. I've always considered myself a night owl. There's something peaceful about the world after dark, when most people are asleep and everything is quiet. That's why I never minded working the night shift at the old hospital in town. It was a small, rural place, with only a few patients at any given time. My job as a security guard was mostly uneventful, just walking the halls, checking the doors, and making sure everything was as it should be. But one night, something happened that I've never been able to forget. A night that still haunts me, even now. The hospital had been around for over 100 years, a relic of the past that had seen its fair share of history. The building itself was a mix of old and new modern wings added onto the original structure, which had once been a sanatorium in the early 1900s. The old part of the hospital was mostly unused, except for storage and a few rooms that hadn't been updated in decades. That area always gave me the creeps, with its peeling wallpaper and dim lighting. But it was my job to patrol it, just like the rest of the building. It was a Friday night, late summer. The air was thick and humid, even inside the cool hospital. My shift started at 11 p.m., and, as usual, I checked in with the nurse on duty, a woman named Linda who had been working there longer than anyone else. She was in her 50s, with a no-nonsense attitude, but she had a kind heart. We chatted briefly, mostly about nothing in particular, before I started my rounds. The hospital was quiet, as it always was at that hour. Only a few patients were in the building, most of them elderly and asleep. The halls were empty, the lights dimmed to save energy. I walked my usual route, starting with the new wing where the patients were, then moving on to the administrative offices and finally to the old part of the hospital. The old wing was always the most unnerving part of my shift. The air seemed different there, heavier somehow. The corridors were narrower, the ceilings lower, and the shadows seemed to cling to the walls like they didn't want to let go. I walked down the long hallway, my footsteps echoing off the tiled floor. Most of the rooms were empty, filled with old furniture and equipment that hadn't been used in years. About halfway through my patrol, I reached a room that had always caught my attention. Room 319. The door was always closed, unlike the other rooms, which were left open. There was nothing special about it, as far as I knew, but it had a strange energy to it, like the air around it was thicker. I had asked Linda about it once, but she just shrugged it off, saying it was just an old storage room. Still, every time I passed it, I felt a slight chill, like something was watching me from behind the door. That night, as I approached room 319, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. It was the first time I had ever seen it open, and my stomach tightened with unease. I hesitated, debating whether or not to investigate. Part of me wanted to just keep walking, to ignore it and finish my rounds, but my duty was to check every room, and I couldn't let a little fear stop me from doing my job. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. I fumbled for the switch on the wall, my fingers brushing against the cool metal before finding the button. The light flickered on, revealing a room that was just as unremarkable as I had been told. A bed covered in a white sheet, a small dresser, and a chair in the corner. Everything was coated in a thin layer of dust, untouched for years. I was about to leave, chalking up the open door to the building's age, when something caught my eye. On the bed, where the sheet had been disturbed, there was a shape. A small, round indentation, as if someone had been sitting there recently. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew that no one had been in this room for years. There was no reason for anyone to be there, and yet, the evidence was undeniable. I took a step back, my mind racing. I wanted to get out of there, to shut the door and forget I had ever seen it. But before I could move, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whisper, soft and indistinct, like a voice carried on the wind. It came from the direction of the bed, but there was no one there. I strained to hear, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper came again, this time clearer, but still too quiet to understand. It sounded like a woman's voice, but the words were impossible to make out. My skin prickled with fear, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My first instinct was to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. I stood there, paralyzed, as the whispering continued, growing louder and more frantic. It was as if whoever, or whatever was in that room was trying desperately to communicate with me, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath missing in the dim light. Finally, I managed to break free from my fear. I stumbled back out of the room, slamming the door behind me. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't waste any time. I turned and practically ran down the hallway, not caring if anyone heard me. I needed to get back to the safety of the main part of the hospital. When I reached the nurse's station, Linda looked up at me, her brow furrowed. "Are you okay?" she asked, clearly sensing that something was wrong. I hesitated, trying to find the right words. I think I heard something. In the old wing." She raised an eyebrow. "Heard something? Like what?" "I don't know," I admitted. "A voice? Maybe." It was coming from one of the rooms, room 319. Linda's expression changed instantly. Her face went pale, and she looked at me with a mixture of concern and something else, something like fear. "Room 319. She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, and for a moment, there was silence between us. Then she let out a long sigh, her shoulders sagging. "I've worked here for over 30 years, she said slowly. "And that room, well, let's just say there's a reason we keep it closed." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What do you mean?" Linda glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening. That room was part of the old sanatorium, back when the hospital was first built. They used to treat tuberculosis patients there, before they knew how to control the spread of the disease. Room 319 was where they put the worst cases, the ones who were too far gone to save. Most of them died in that room. I swallowed hard, the fear I had felt earlier returning tenfold. But that was years ago, I said, trying to rationalize what I had experienced. It doesn't explain what I heard tonight. Linda looked at me with a serious expression. There have been stories over the years, staff members who have heard voices, seen things that shouldn't be there. Some people believe that the patients who died in that room never really left. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to dismiss it as just a story, but after what I had just experienced, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. Something I didn't understand. Linda must have seen the fear in my eyes, because she reached out and placed a reassuring hand on my arm. Whatever it was, it can't hurt you, she said firmly. The spirits, if they are spirits, they're just echoes. They're trapped in that room, reliving their final moments. But they're not dangerous. I nodded slowly, though her words did little to comfort me. I spent the rest of my shift avoiding the old wing, sticking close to the well-lit, familiar parts of the hospital. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had heard. The way the whispering had seemed so desperate, so full of longing. When my shift finally ended, I left the hospital as quickly as I could. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light over the parking lot as I got into my car. But even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something from the darkness of room 319. For weeks after that night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that whispering voice, faint but persistent, as if it was calling to me from beyond the grave. I couldn't escape the memory of that room, the cold air, and the feeling that something unseen was standing just behind me, just out of sight. I continued working at the hospital, but I never went back to the old wing at night. I made excuses, finding ways to avoid that part of my rounds. I wasn't the only one. Other guards who had been there longer than me had their own stories, their own reasons for steering clear of room 319. Eventually, I left that job, moving on to something less stressful. But even now, years later, I can't forget what happened. I've told this story to a few close friends, and while some of them laugh it off, others listen with the same uneasy expression had that night. I know what I experienced was real, even if I can't explain it. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I still hear that whispering voice, faint and distant, like it's trying to tell me something I don't want to hear. The worst part is, I'll never know what it was saying, or why it chose me. All I can do is hope that whatever it was, it's finally found peace. But deep down, I know that some things never truly rest. They linger, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reach out and make themselves known. And when they do, all you can do is listen, and hope that you're strong enough to walk away. I was lucky. I survived, but not everyone who hears the whispering is so fortunate. And that's something I'll never forget. I had always loved the woods. As a child, my parents would take me camping, and I'd spend hours exploring the trees, pretending I was a great adventurer or a forest ranger. The scent of pine needles and the crunch of leaves underfoot became synonymous with freedom and adventure. So, when I moved to a small town surrounded by dense forests, it felt like coming home. Little did I know that this love for the woods would lead me to the most terrifying experience of my life. Blackwood Forest was a sprawling, ancient woodland that bordered the town. It was a place of local legend, filled with stories of strange occurrences and sightings of shadowy figures. Most of the townspeople dismissed these tales as nothing more than the imagination of those with too much time on their hands. But a few, especially the older residents, would speak of the forest with a kind of reverence, and sometimes fear. I had been living in the town for about a year when I first heard about Blackwood's dark history. A few co-workers and I were at a local pub, unwinding after a long week. As the night wore on, and the beer flowed freely, conversation inevitably turned to the forest. "You've heard about the disappearances, right?" asked Tom, one of the older men in our group, his voice low and serious. I shook my head, intrigued. Disappearances. Tom nodded. Over the years, a few people have gone into those woods and never come out, mostly hunters or hikers. They say the forest doesn't want to let them go. Come on, Tom. Don't scare the new guy, laughed Sarah, a younger woman who worked in accounting. It's just a forest. People get lost, that's all. Tom shrugged but didn't argue. Instead, he took another swig of his beer and muttered something about not tempting fate. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was more interested in exploring the forest than in old ghost stories. So, the next weekend, I packed a small bag with snacks, a flashlight, and a map, and set out to explore Blackwood on my own. I had planned to spend the day hiking and maybe camping overnight if I found a good spot. The entrance to the forest was about a 15-minute drive from my house. The moment I stepped out of the car and into the shadow of the trees, I felt a strange energy in the air, like the forest was alive and watching me. I dismissed the feeling as nerves and started down the narrow trail. The deeper I went into the forest, the more I felt like I was stepping back in time. The trees were enormous, their trunks gnarled and twisted, with roots that jutted out of the ground like ancient bones. The canopy above was so thick that it blocked out most of the sunlight, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. I walked for hours, following the trail as it wound deeper into the woods. The air was cool and damp, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. I felt a sense of peace, as if I had left the world behind and entered a place where time stood still. As afternoon turned to evening, I found a small clearing near a stream and decided to set up camp. I pitched my tent, built a small fire, and sat back to enjoy the solitude. The forest was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I hadn't seen or heard any signs of wildlife for hours, and the stillness was beginning to get to me. Just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard a faint rustling in the bushes behind my tent. I froze, listening intently. The sound was too soft to be a large animal, but it was definitely something moving through the underbrush, probably just a raccoon or a rabbit, I told myself, but the unease in my gut wouldn't go away. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the source of the noise. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and bushes, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided to go to bed, hoping that sleep would take the edge off my nerves. But as I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the crackle of the dying fire outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the reach of the light. The night was long, and I tossed and turned, unable to find rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined I could hear faint whispers, like voices carried on the wind. But every time I sat up and listened, there was nothing, just the silence of the forest. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep, though it was fitful and filled with uneasy dreams. I dreamed of the forest, but it wasn't the peaceful place I had loved as a child. In my dream, the trees were alive, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, trying to grab me. I ran through the woods, but no matter how fast I went, the trees closed in around me, their twisted faces leering down, their whispers growing louder and more urgent. I woke with a start, my heart pounding, drenched in sweat. The fire had long since died, and the inside of the tent was pitch black. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hand shaking. When I finally managed to turn it on, the light flickered weakly, as if the batteries were dying. I was about to step outside to relight the fire when I heard it again, the rustling in the bushes. But this time, it was closer, almost right outside the tent. Fear surged through me, and I sat frozen, listening. The rustling grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was moving around my campsite. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Could it be another person, a hunter, or another camper? But who would be out here in the middle of the night? Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a low, guttural growl, like that of an animal. But it wasn't any animal I had ever heard before. It sounded wrong, distorted, as if it was coming from deep within the earth. I held my breath, too terrified to move. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and then I heard the sound of heavy footsteps, like something large was circling my tent. Panic took over, and I grabbed my backpack and flashlight, bolting out of the tent. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I had to get away from whatever was out there. I ran, not caring which direction I went, just needing to put as much distance between myself and the campsite as possible. The forest closed in around me, the trees casting long, twisted shadows in the weak beam of my flashlight. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs burned from the effort, but I didn't stop. Eventually, I stumbled into another clearing, collapsing to the ground, gasping for air. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. As I lay there, trying to catch my breath, I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea where I was. In my panic, I had run blindly into the forest, straying far from the trail. The trees towered over me, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, but the sound of the wind only made me more anxious. It was too quiet, too still. I fumbled with my map, trying to figure out my location, but the light from my flashlight was too dim to make out any details. The batteries were nearly dead, and the thought of being stuck in the dark, lost and alone in this cursed forest, made my heart race with fear. I had to keep moving. I couldn't stay in one place, not with whatever was out there, stalking me. I stuffed the map back into my pack and stood up, trying to steady my breathing. My legs were shaking, but I forced myself to take one step, then another, back into the forest. The woods were a labyrinth of twisted trees and dense underbrush. Every branch seemed to snag at my clothes, and every shadow looked like something lurking in the darkness. My mind played tricks on me, making me see movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The growling had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. I couldn't tell if whatever had been stalking me was still out there, watching and waiting. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots and the rapid thumping of my own heart. As I stumbled through the forest, I tried to remember the layout of the land, to piece together some sense of direction. I knew there was a river that cut through the woods, and if I could find it, I could follow it downstream to safety. But in the darkness, with my dying flashlight, every direction looked the same. Then, out of the darkness, I heard it again, the faint rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, straining to hear. The sound was closer now, moving toward me from somewhere in the trees. I slowly turned, raising the flashlight to illuminate the source of the noise. The beam was weak, barely cutting through the darkness, but I caught a glimpse of something, a shadowy figure, just beyond the edge of the light. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch into the darkness. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew, instinctively, that it wasn't human. A cold wave of terror washed over me, and I backed away, my legs trembling. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching me from the shadows. The darkness seemed to pulse around it, like a living thing, and the air grew thick with an oppressive, suffocating energy. I turned and ran, my flashlight flickering with every step. The forest blurred around me, the trees merging into a dark, twisting maze. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that thing, whatever it was. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the forest floor, gasping for air. My flashlight finally died, plunging me into complete darkness. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. I lay there, too exhausted and terrified to move, listening for any sign of the figure. But the forest was silent, the oppressive energy gone as if it had never been there. Hours passed, or it was just minutes. It was impossible to tell in the darkness. I lay on the cold ground, clutching my dead flashlight like a lifeline, too afraid to move. I didn't know if the figure was still out there, watching me, or if it had left. But I wasn't about to find out. Eventually, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I gathered the strength to stand. My body ached, and my clothes were torn and dirty, but I was alive. I had survived the night. With the weak light of dawn guiding me, I managed to find my way back to the trail. It took hours, but eventually, I stumbled out of the forest and onto the road where my car was parked. I didn't look back as I climbed into the car, my hands still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I drove straight home, not stopping until I was safely inside my house, the door locked behind me. Only then did I allow myself to break down, the terror of the night finally catching up to me. I never went back to Blackwood Forest. In fact, I moved out of the town a few months later, unable to shake the feeling that the forest was watching me, waiting for me to return. I never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. The few times I've tried, I've always been met with skeptical looks and dismissive comments about an overactive imagination, but I know what I saw, what I felt. There's something in those woods, something ancient and malevolent, and it's still out there, waiting for the next person to wander too deep into Blackwood Forest. So, if you ever find yourself near that town, and you're tempted to explore the woods, remember my story. Stay on the trails. Don't linger after dark, and whatever you do, don't listen to the whispers in the trees, because once you hear them, it's already too late. Growing up, I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. I was the kind of person who scoffed at horror movies and dismissed eerie stories as figments of overactive imaginations. But all that changed one summer when my friends and I decided to go on a camping trip deep in the woods. What was meant to be a weekend of relaxation and fun turned into the most terrifying experience of my life, one that still haunts me to this day. It all started when my friend, Mark, suggested the idea of camping in an isolated part of the national forest. Mark had always been the adventurous type, constantly seeking out new thrills and challenges. He'd heard about a secluded area deep in the woods, far from any established campgrounds, and convinced the rest of us, Sarah, James, and me, that it would be the perfect spot for an unforgettable weekend. I promise, it'll be worth it, Mark said as we packed our gear into the back of his SUV. No crowds, no noise, just us and nature. It'll be the ultimate camping experience. I hesitated, but the thought of escaping the stresses of daily life and spending time with my closest friends was too tempting to pass up. So, I agreed, and we set off early on a Friday morning, eager for adventure. The drive took longer than expected. We left the paved roads behind, navigating narrow, winding dirt paths that seemed to grow more treacherous the deeper we went into the forest. The trees loomed overhead, their thick branches blocking out the sun, casting long, dark shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. After several hours, Mark finally pulled the SUV to a stop. "We're here," he announced, grinning as he pointed to a small clearing just off the path. "This is where we'll set up camp." The clearing was surrounded by dense woods on all sides, with a small stream running through the middle. It was picturesque, but there was something about the place that made me feel uneasy. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. We spent the afternoon setting up our tents and gathering firewood. By the time the sun began to set, we were settled around a crackling fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The warmth of the fire and the camaraderie of my friends helped to ease my earlier apprehensions, and I began to relax, enjoying the peacefulness of our remote location. That, as the night grew darker, the conversation shifted to local legends and ghost stories. Mark, of course, was full of them, regaling us with tales of haunted woods and cursed cabins. We laughed and teased him, dismissing his stories as nothing more than campfire fodder. But then Sarah spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know, my grandmother used to tell me about a cabin in these woods," she said, her eyes wide with an unsettling seriousness. "She said it was built a long time ago, back when settlers first came to this area. According to her, the family who lived there disappeared without a trace. No one ever found out what happened to them, but people say the cabin is still out there, hidden somewhere in the forest. She always warned me to stay away from these woods, so they were cursed." The mood around the fire shifted, and a heavy silence fell over us. Even Mark, who was usually quick to dismiss such stories, seemed unsettled by Sarah's words. "Come on, Sarah, you don't really believe that, do you?" James asked, trying to lighten the mood. Sarah shrugged, her gaze fixed on the fire. "I don't know. My grandmother was a no-nonsense kind of woman, not one to make up stories. She believed it, and she was always careful about these woods. Maybe there's something to it." We all sat quietly for a moment, the weight of her story hanging in the air. I tried to shake off the creeping sense of unease, reminding myself that it was just a story, nothing more. But the longer we sat there, the more I couldn't help but feel that we weren't as alone in the woods as we thought. Eventually, we decided to turn in for the night. As I crawled into my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves and making the trees sway ominously, I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting Sarah's story get to me. But sleep didn't come easily. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a strange sound. It was faint at first, a distant, rhythmic thudding that seemed to be coming from the woods. I lay still, holding my breath, trying to determine if it was real or just a dream. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it was very real. I sat up, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The noise was getting closer, accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible humming. It was an eerie, unnatural sound that sent chills down my spine. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting a dim, flickering light over the campsite. The woods beyond were pitch black, and I couldn't see anything, but the sound was definitely coming from the trees. I glanced over at my friends' tents. They were all still zipped up, no signs of movement. I considered waking them, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself, trying to rationalize the noise. But as the sound drew nearer, I realized it wasn't the footsteps of an animal. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like someone or something was walking through the woods with a purpose. I felt a surge of panic, and without thinking, I crawled out of my tent and crept toward Marks. I reached out to shake him awake, but before I could, the sound stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, and I froze, my hand hovering over the tent's zipper. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, listening, waiting for the sound to start again. But there was nothing, just the whisper of the wind and the distant call of an owl. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself that whatever it was had gone. Maybe it had been an animal, after all, and I was just overreacting. I was about to turn back to my tent when I heard it again, a soft, low hum, this time coming from directly behind me. My blood ran cold, and I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. There, just beyond the dying light of the fire, was a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. For a moment, I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even scream. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a person, an animal, something else entirely? Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the trees, the low hum fading with it. I stood there, trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to wake my friends, to tell them what I had seen, but something stopped me. A deep, primal instinct told me that whatever that thing was, it was dangerous, and drawing attention to it would only make things worse. Instead, I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the spot where the figure had disappeared. When I reached my tent, I crawled inside and zipped it up tight, my hands shaking. I lay there for the rest of the night, wide awake, every sound amplified in the darkness. I didn't hear the hum or the footsteps again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching us. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from my tent, exhausted and on edge. My friends were already up, chatting and making breakfast as if nothing had happened. I considered telling them about what I had seen, but I hesitated, unsure of how they would react. Would they believe me, or would they dismiss it as a nightmare, a trick of the light? In the end, I decided to keep it to myself. Maybe it was nothing, I reasoned. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me after hearing Sarah's story. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. We spent the rest of the day exploring the area, hiking through the dense woods and following the stream to a small waterfall. The beauty of the forest in the daylight helped to calm my nerves, and for a while, I almost managed to convince myself that the events of the previous night had been nothing more than a bad dream. But, as the sun began to set, that familiar sense of unease returned, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for night to fall. That evening, as we sat around the fire once more, I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the figure. My friends noticed my unease and teased me about it, but I forced a laugh, not wanting to alarm them. Eventually, we all turned in for the night, but sleep was impossible. I lay in my tent, wide awake, every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig sending my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the figure was out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. Hours passed in tense silence, and just when I thought I might finally be able to drift off, I heard it again, the low, rhythmic thudding, accompanied by that eerie hum. My blood ran cold, and I sat up, straining to hear. The sound was closer this time, moving slowly through the woods toward our campsite. I couldn't see anything through the walls of my tent, but I could feel its presence, growing nearer with each passing moment. I was torn between the urge to run and the fear that moving would draw its attention. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I wake my friends? Should I hide? But before I could decide, the sound stopped. Just like the night before, silence descended over the campsite, thick and oppressive. I held my breath, waiting, listening for any sign of movement. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadowy figure standing just outside my tent, barely visible in the dim light. It was the same figure from the night before, tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, and I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. I could feel its eyes on me, cold and malevolent, and I knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't human. For what felt like an eternity, the figure stood there, watching me, its presence filling the air with a suffocating sense of dread. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, trapped in my own terror. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and melted back into the shadows, the hum fading with it. I collapsed onto my sleeping bag, trembling uncontrollably. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. What was it? Why was it watching us? And most importantly, what did it want? I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, I was the first one out of my tent, eager to leave the campsite and put as much distance between us and that thing as possible. I quickly packed up my gear, urging my friends to do the same. They noticed my frantic behavior and asked what was wrong, but I brushed them off, not wanting to explain. I just wanted to get out of there. As we hiked back to the SUV, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing, and I constantly glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure lurking in the shadows. But we made it back to the SUV without incident, and as we drove away from the forest, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The further we got from the woods, the more the oppressive sense of dread began to lift. By the time we reached civilization, I almost felt normal again. My friends were laughing and chatting, excitedly recounting the highlights of the trip, but I remained silent, lost in my thoughts. That night, as I lay in my own bed, I finally allowed myself to relax. I was safe, far from the woods and whatever had been stalking us. I told myself it was over, that I could put the whole experience behind me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I had seen something in those woods, something I couldn't explain, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had seen me too. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure. It haunted my dreams, its shadowy form lurking just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the stress of the trip had gotten to me, but the memories were too vivid, too real. I started researching local legends and stories, trying to find any explanation for what I had seen. I scoured the internet, read old books and articles, but I found nothing that matched my experience. As the weeks turned into months, the terror I had felt in the woods began to fade, replaced by a gnawing curiosity. What was it that I had seen? Why was it there? And why did it let us go? I never told my friends about the figure. They moved on from the trip, chalking it up as just another adventure. But I couldn't forget. I kept my experience to myself, afraid of what they might think, but the questions continued to eat away at me. Eventually, I came to a decision. I had to go back. I know it sounds insane, but the need to understand what had happened, to confront the figure, became an obsession. I needed answers, and the only way to get them was to return to the woods. I waited until the next summer, when the weather was warm and the days were long. I didn't tell anyone about my plan, not wanting them to worry or try to stop me. I packed my gear and drove out to the same dirt path that had led us to the campsite, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. The forest was just as I remembered it, dark, silent, and foreboding. As I made my way to the clearing, memories of that night flooded back, and I had to fight the urge to turn and run. But I pushed forward, determined to see this through. When I reached the clearing, I found it just as we had left it. The remnants of our fire pit were still there, now cold and overgrown with weeds. The stream babbled softly in the background, its sound oddly comforting in the eerie silence. I set up my tent and waited. The hours ticked by slowly, the sun inching across the sky. As dusk approached, that familiar sense of unease returned, tightening around my chest like a vice. I sat by the fire, just as we had done a year ago, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every snap and crackle of the fire made me jump, and my eyes constantly scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. As night fell, the forest grew eerily quiet. The usual sounds of nocturnal animals were replaced by an oppressive silence. My heart raced, and I forced myself to stay calm, reminding myself why I was here. Then, just as before, I heard it, the low, rhythmic thudding, accompanied by that eerie hum. My blood ran cold, and I froze, listening as the sound grew closer, just as it had that night. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew it was coming, that I was about to see the figure again, but this time I was ready. This time I wouldn't run. The sound stopped, and I held my breath, waiting. The seconds stretched into an eternity, the silence thick and suffocating. And then, there it was, the shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just as before. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and malevolent. My heart hammered in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I took a step toward the figure, my hands trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me, its presence filling the air with that same suffocating sense of dread. I took another step closer, my fear warring with my need for answers. "Why are you here? What are you?" The figure remained silent, but the hum grew louder, filling my ears until it was all I could hear. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and I felt a surge of panic, but I pushed it down, refusing to give in to the fear. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, my voice shaking. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the figure began to dissolve into the shadows, its form growing fainter and fainter until it was nothing more than a wisp of darkness. The hum faded, and the oppressive weight lifted from the air. The forest was silent once more, as if the figure had never been there at all. I stood there, trembling, my heart racing. I had done it. I had confronted the figure, faced my fear. But as I stood there in the clearing, I realized something unsettling. I still didn't have any answers. The figure hadn't spoken, hadn't given me any clue as to what it was or why it was here. I was left with nothing but more questions, and the uneasy feeling that I hadn't seen the last of it. I packed up my gear and left the forest, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. I had come seeking answers, but all I had found was more mystery. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, watching, waiting. In the years since that night, I've tried to move on, to forget about the figure and the forest. But it's always there, lurking in the back of my mind, a shadowy presence that refuses to be ignored. I don't know what it was that I saw in those woods, or why it seemed to be drawn to me. I don't know if it was a ghost, a spirit, or something else entirely, but I do know one thing: it was real. And whatever it was, it's still out there. So, if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, far from the safety of civilization, remember my story. Trust your instincts, and if you ever hear that low, rhythmic thudding and eerie hum, don't ignore it. Don't try to confront it. Just leave, because once you see the figure, it will never leave you alone. It all started with a simple invitation, a text message from an old friend, an offer to reconnect after years of silence. I hadn't heard from Alex in ages, not since we graduated from college and went our separate ways. We'd been close once, sharing the same love for hiking, camping, and all things outdoors. But life had pulled us in different directions, and we lost touch. So when his message popped up on my phone one chilly October morning, I was surprised, to say the least. "Hey, Chris, long time no see. How have you been?" I'm organizing a weekend getaway with some old friends at this cabin in the woods, totally secluded, surrounded by nature, just like old times. It'd be great if you could join us. What do you say? The idea of a weekend away from the chaos of my life was tempting. My job had been stressful lately, and the thought of escaping into the wilderness, even for a couple of days, was too good to pass up. I replied almost immediately, telling Alex I was in. We made plans to meet the following Friday after work. The cabin was in a place called Hollow Creek, about a 4-hour drive from the city. Alex told me it was the perfect spot, far enough from civilization to feel truly disconnected, but close enough to a small town in case we needed anything. He said there would be 4 of us: Alex, myself, his girlfriend Emily, and another friend from college, Marcus. As the week went on, I found myself growing more and more excited about the trip. It felt like the perfect opportunity to catch up with old friends, recharge, and maybe even recapture some of the camaraderie we had during our college days. Finally, Friday arrived. I packed up my gear: hiking boots, a warm jacket, a sleeping bag, and a few other essentials before hitting the road. The drive was uneventful, the city gradually giving way to rolling hills and dense forests. As I got closer to Hollow Creek, the landscape became more rugged, the roads narrower and less maintained. By the time I reached the dirt path that led to the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trees. I followed the winding path for what felt like an eternity, the trees closing in on either side, their branches almost touching overhead. Just as I was beginning to wonder if I'd taken a wrong turn, the cabin came into view. It was a quaint, rustic structure nestled among the trees, with a small porch and a stone chimney. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and I could see the warm glow of firelight flickering through the windows. As I pulled up, I noticed Alex's car parked nearby, along with 2 others. I felt a surge of anticipation as I grabbed my bag and headed toward the cabin. The door opened before I could knock, and Alex stepped out to greet me. "Chris, you made it," he said, grinning from ear to ear. He looked much the same as I remembered, tall, with unruly dark hair and a scruffy beard. He pulled me into a bear hug before stepping back to let me inside. "Come on in, everyone's here." We were just about to start dinner. I stepped into the cabin, instantly enveloped in warmth. The interior was cozy, with wooden beams overhead and a stone fireplace crackling away. Emily and Marcus were sitting at the large wooden table in the center of the room, chatting and laughing. Emily waved when she saw me, and Marcus gave me a nod of acknowledgement. We spent the evening catching up, reminiscing about old times, and enjoying a hearty meal that Emily had prepared. The conversation flowed easily, the years of distance between us melting away. It felt good to be with these people again, to reconnect with the parts of my life I'd almost forgotten. As the night wore on, we eventually moved to the living room, where the fire burned low in the hearth. Alex broke out a bottle of whiskey, and we passed it around, the warmth of the alcohol adding to the relaxed atmosphere. We talked about everything: our jobs, our relationships, the paths our lives had taken since college. But eventually, the conversation turned to the cabin itself. "So, how did you find this place?" I asked, swirling the whiskey in my glass. "It's pretty out of the way." Alex leaned back in his chair, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Actually, it belongs to a friend of mine. He mentioned it to me a while back, said it was the perfect spot for getting away from it all. I thought it'd be a great place for a reunion, so I asked if we could use it for the weekend. It's definitely secluded," Emily added, glancing out the window. The night outside was pitch black, the trees barely visible in the dim light from the cabin. "I don't think I've ever been anywhere this quiet before." "Yeah, it's almost eerie," Marcus said with a chuckle. "But that's part of the charm." "Right. No cell service, no distractions, just us and nature." We all nodded in agreement, the conversation drifting to other topics as the night wore on. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. The cabin had 2 bedrooms and a loft, so we divided up the sleeping arrangements: Alex and Emily in one room, Marcus and I in the other. As I settled into bed, I couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. It had been a long time since I'd felt this relaxed, this disconnected from the outside world. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the cabin creaked occasionally as it settled in the cool night air. I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the sounds of the forest and the warmth of the fire. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, the room pitch black and silent. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. I didn't remember hearing any loud noises or having any disturbing dreams. But as I lay there, I became aware of a feeling of unease, a sense that something wasn't quite right. I sat up in bed, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. The cabin was silent, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves outside. I glanced over at Marcus, who was fast asleep, his steady breathing the only indication that he was even there. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings, the isolation getting to me. But as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin suddenly felt too quiet, too still, as if the very air was holding its breath. I must have eventually fallen back to sleep, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. The sense of unease from the night before had dissipated, replaced by the normalcy of a new day. I got up and headed to the kitchen, where I found Alex and Emily making breakfast. The smell of bacon and eggs filled the cabin, and I felt my mood lift as I joined them at the table. "Morning, Chris," Emily said with a smile. "Sleep well?" "Yeah, mostly," I replied, helping myself to a plate of food. "Woke up in the middle of the night, though. I guess I'm not used to how quiet it is out here." Alex chuckled. "Yeah, it takes some getting used to, but that's part of the appeal, right? No city noise. No distractions, just peace and quiet." I nodded, trying to shake off the lingering sense of unease. I didn't want to ruin the mood by bringing up my strange experience, so I pushed it to the back of my mind and focused on enjoying the day. After breakfast, we decided to go for a hike. The area around the cabin was beautiful, with dense forests, rolling hills, and a crystal clear lake. We spent the day exploring, taking in the sights and breathing in the fresh mountain air. It was the kind of day that made you forget about all your worries, the kind of day that made you appreciate the simple pleasures in life. By the time we returned to the cabin, we were all tired, but happy. We spent the evening much like the night before, eating, drinking, and talking late into the night. The sense of camaraderie was strong, the bond between us growing stronger with each passing hour. But as the night wore on, that familiar sense of unease began to creep back in. It started as a nagging feeling at the back of my mind, a sense that something was watching us from the darkness outside. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But it was hard to shake. At one point, I glanced over at the window and thought I saw something moving in the shadows outside. It was just a brief flicker of movement, so quick that I wasn't sure if I'd really seen it or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I considered mentioning it to the others, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. After all, we were in the middle of the woods. It was probably just an animal. But as the hours ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I found myself glancing at the windows more and more, half expecting to see something staring back at me from the darkness. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. I went to bed with that same sense of unease hanging over me, and I couldn't help but wonder if the others felt it too. I woke up again in the middle of the night, the room once again pitch black. This time, however, the unease was more intense, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was something wrong, something out there in the darkness. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I listened carefully, straining to hear anything that might explain the feeling. At first, there was nothing, just the same eerie silence. But then, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound coming from outside the cabin. It was faint, like something brushing against the wood of the cabin, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as I listened, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It grew louder, more distinct, as if whatever was making it was moving closer to the window. I turned my head slowly, my eyes locked on the dark glass, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. But there was nothing there, just the inky blackness of the night. The scratching continued, persistent and unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was trying to get in, something that didn't belong in this world. My mind raced with possibilities: an animal, a branch rubbing against the cabin, my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something I couldn't explain. I glanced over at Marcus, who was still fast asleep, oblivious to the sound. I didn't want to wake him, didn't want to admit that I was scared out of my mind. So I lay back down, pulling the covers up to my chin, and tried to ignore the sound, but it didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was out there was determined to get inside. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to go away, telling myself it was nothing. But the scratching continued, relentless and terrifying. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, thick and suffocating, like the calm before a storm. I lay there, my heart pounding in my ears, waiting for anything to happen, but nothing did. The silence stretched on, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound, for fear that whatever was out there would hear me. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. Haunted by the sound of that scratching dot the next morning, I woke up feeling groggy and disoriented, the events of the night before playing through my mind like a bad dream. I half expected to find scratches on the outside of the cabin, some physical evidence that would confirm what I'd heard. But when I went outside to check, there was nothing, no marks on the wood, no signs that anything had been there at all. I felt a mixture of relief and unease. Had it all been in my head? Was I losing my mind? I didn't want to believe it, but the absence of any evidence made me question what I'd experienced. I didn't mention it to the others, not wanting to worry them or make myself look foolish. But, as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that whatever had caused that sound was still out there, watching us. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the sense of unease lingered. We went for another hike, this time sticking closer to the cabin, but I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the trees. When night fell, I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. I didn't want to go to bed, didn't want to face the darkness and the silence again, but I couldn't exactly stay up all night without raising suspicion. So I forced myself to go to bed, hoping that whatever had happened the night before was just a one-time thing. But it wasn't. I woke up in the middle of the night again, the same sense of unease washing over me like a wave. The cabin was silent, but this time I felt something else, a presence, something heavy and oppressive in the air. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat as I strained to hear anything out of the ordinary. The scratching started again, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. I felt a surge of panic, my heart racing as I glanced over at the window. There was something out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, its presence pressing in on me from all sides. I wanted to wake Marcus, to tell him what I was hearing, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be out there, what could be making that sound. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was out there was desperate to get in. The growling grew more distinct, a low, menacing rumble that made my blood run cold. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest as I ran to the door and flung it open. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, and I stumbled outside, desperate to get away from whatever was in the cabin. But as soon as I stepped outside, the sound stopped. The scratching, the growling, everything. The silence was so complete, so overwhelming, that it made my head spin. I looked around, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the stillness of the night and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to make sense of what had just happened, but there was nothing, no explanation, no sign that anything had been there at all. Eventually, I forced myself to go back inside. Marcus was still asleep, oblivious to everything that had happened. I crawled back into bed, my heart still pounding, and lay there, staring up at the ceiling, too scared to close my eyes. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. I don't think I slept at all, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have been out there, what could have made those sounds. When morning finally came, I was a wreck. I couldn't hide my fear anymore, and when the others saw me, they knew something was wrong. I told them everything, the scratching, the growling, the sense of unease that had been building since we arrived. At first, they were skeptical, but when they saw how shaken I was, they started to take me seriously. We searched the cabin and the area around it, looking for any signs that something had been there, but we found nothing. In the end, we decided to cut the trip short. We packed up our things and left the cabin, none of us wanting to spend another night in that place. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something that didn't want us there. I don't know what it was, and I don't think I ever will, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never go back to Hollow Creek. When Daniel suggested we go camping, I jumped at the chance. Life in the city had worn me down, and the idea of escaping to the wilderness with my best friend felt like exactly what I needed. We'd been planning the trip for months, talking about the trails we'd hike and the fish we'd catch. But nothing could have prepared me for what actually happened. We decided to head to the White Mountains in New Hampshire, a place we'd both been to before, but never together. Daniel had found a remote campsite that wasn't on any of the popular trails, a spot known only to those who'd done their homework. It was supposed to be isolated, peaceful, the kind of place where you could forget about the rest of the world. But as we drove deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were driving into something else entirely. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, then to dirt, narrowing as we went. The trees on either side seemed to close in, the canopy above blocking out more and more of the sunlight. Daniel, who was driving, seemed unfazed, chatting about work and how good it would be to get away from it all. I nodded along, but my mind was elsewhere. Something about the place felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on it. We finally reached the end of the road, a small clearing with just enough space for Daniel's truck. I stepped out, stretching my legs and taking in the surroundings. The air was cool, and there was a slight breeze that rustled the leaves, but everything else was still, ready for an adventure. Daniel asked, grinning as he slung his backpack over his shoulder. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Let's do this." We hiked for about 2 hours, the trail barely visible beneath the thick underbrush. The further we went, the more I felt like we were being swallowed by the forest. The trees grew taller, older, their branches twisted and gnarled. The path itself seemed ancient, as if it hadn't been walked in years. There were no signs, no markers, nothing to indicate that anyone had ever been there before us. When we finally reached the campsite, I was both relieved and unsettled. It was a small clearing, just big enough for our 2 tents, surrounded on all sides by dense forest. The trees here were so thick that it felt like we were in a room with walls of bark and leaves. A small stream ran nearby, its water clear and cold, but the sound of it was almost drowned out by the oppressive silence of the woods. We set up camp quickly, more out of a desire to be done with it than anything else. The unease I'd felt on the hike had grown stronger, and I could tell Daniel felt it too, though he was trying to hide it. We talked less and less as we worked, each of us lost in our own thoughts. By the time the sun began to set, a thick fog had rolled in, blanketing the forest in a ghostly white. The fire we'd built seemed to do little to push back the darkness, its flames flickering weakly in the damp air. We sat around it, eating our dinner in near silence. "I don't like this place," I finally said, breaking the quiet. Daniel looked up at me, his face half lit by the fire. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It just feels wrong. Like we shouldn't be here." He didn't say anything for a long time, just stared into the flames. "It's just the isolation," he said at last. "We're not used to being this far from civilization. It's playing tricks on our minds." "Maybe," I muttered, though I wasn't convinced. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching me. The walls of the tent seemed to close in, and the sound of the forest, normally so soothing, was oppressive. I lay there, listening to the faint rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the slow, steady breathing of Daniel in the tent next to mine. But underneath it all, there was something else. A whisper, so faint I thought I was imagining it. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind. But as the hours dragged on, the whisper grew louder, more insistent. It was like a voice, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I strained to make out the words, but they slipped through my mind like water through my fingers. I wanted to call out to Daniel, to ask if he was hearing it too, but something held me back. A deep, primal fear rooted me in place. telling me that whatever was making that sound, it wasn't something I wanted to acknowledge. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke the next morning, the fog was still there, clinging to the trees like a shroud. The air was cold, and my breath came out in misty puffs as I crawled out of the tent. Daniel was already up, poking at the remnants of the fire with a stick. "Morning," he said, glancing up at me. He looked as tired as I felt. "Morning," I replied, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "Did you sleep okay?" "Not really," he admitted. "Kept hearing things all night. Weird." "Huh?" I nodded, relieved that I wasn't the only one who had heard the whispers. "Yeah, same here. Thought it was just my imagination." "Maybe it was," Daniel said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Let's just get some breakfast and head out for a hike. Fresh air will do us good." We ate quickly, neither of us talking much, and then set out on the trail. The fog made it hard to see more than a few feet in any direction, and the forest seemed even more claustrophobic than before. The trees loomed over us, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. As we walked, the silence grew heavier, pressing down on us. I found myself jumping at every little sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, and I could tell Daniel was just as on edge. The whispering from the night before echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. At about an hour of hiking, we came to a small, overgrown path that branched off from the main trail. Daniel paused, looking down it with a frown. "This wasn't on the map," he said, more to himself than to me. "Maybe we should stick to the main trail," I suggested, not liking the look of the narrow, dark path, but Daniel shook his head. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure? It might lead to something interesting." I wanted to argue, to tell him that I had a bad feeling about this, but the stubborn set of his jaw told me it was pointless. So I followed him down the path, my unease growing with every step. The further we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees were older here, their trunks thicker, their bark dark and rough. The air was still, the only sound the crunch of our boots on the dead leaves. After about 20 minutes, we came to a small clearing, barely more than a gap in the trees. In the center of it was something that made my blood run cold. It was a stone circle, about 10 feet in diameter, made up of large, flat stones that looked ancient. The ground inside the circle was bare, the dirt a dark, almost black color. There were strange symbols carved into the stones, their meanings lost to time. "What the hell, this?" I whispered, more to myself than to Daniel. He didn't answer, just stepped closer to the circle, his eyes wide with curiosity. I wanted to tell him to stop, to get away from it, but the words wouldn't come. I felt like I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, as if the circle itself was holding me in place. Daniel reached out to touch one of the stones, and the moment his fingers brushed it, the air around us seemed to shift. The fog thickened, swirling around us, and the temperature dropped suddenly. I could see my breath, coming in short, panicked gasps, and the whispering started again, louder this time, all around us. "Daniel," I managed to choke out, my voice trembling with fear. "We need to go. Now." He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned, his face pale. "Yeah," he said, his voice shaky. "Let's get out of here." We turned and practically ran back the way we'd come, the whispering growing louder with every step. It felt like the forest was closing in on us, the trees shifting and moving, trying to trap us. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps as we finally burst out onto the main trail. We didn't stop running until we were back at the campsite, both of us doubled over, trying to catch our breath. The whispering had stopped, but the memory of it still echoed in my mind. "What the hell was that?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, shaking my head. "But we need to leave. Now." He didn't argue, just nodded, and we quickly started packing up our gear. The fog was still thick, and the air felt heavy, oppressive, like we were being watched. Every sound, every movement in the trees made me jump, my nerves on edge. As we loaded our packs into the truck, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, darting between the trees, too fast for me to get a good look. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned to Daniel, but he was already in the driver's seat, starting the engine. "Let's go," I said, climbing into the passenger seat. Now, Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He slammed the truck into gear, and we sped down the dirt road, the tires kicking up dust as we went. I kept looking back, half expecting to see something following us, but there was nothing. Just the fog, thick and unrelenting, until we finally broke through it and onto the main road. We didn't talk much on the drive back. The tension between us was palpable, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The events of the past 24 hours felt like a bad dream, something that couldn't possibly be real. But the fear, the dread that still clung to me, told me otherwise. When we finally reached the city, the familiar sights and sounds of civilization did little to ease my mind. I felt like I was in a daze, my body on autopilot as I unloaded my gear and said goodbye to Daniel. He looked as shaken as I felt, but neither of us knew what to say. As I drove home, I kept replaying the events of the trip in my mind, trying to make sense of it all, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't explain what had happened. The whispers, the stone circle, the feeling of being watched, it was like something out of a nightmare, something that shouldn't exist in the real world. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with thoughts of the forest, of the dark, ancient trees and the whispers in the fog. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard them again, faint but unmistakable, like they were calling to me, beckoning me back to that place. I haven't spoken to Daniel since the trip. I know I should reach out, try to talk about what happened, but I can't bring myself to do it. It's like a part of me wants to forget, to pretend that it was all just a bad dream. But I know better. Deep down, I know that what we experienced was real, and the thought of going back, of facing whatever it was that we disturbed, fills me with a terror I've never known. So I stay in the city, surrounded by people, by noise and light. But even here, I can't escape the feeling that I'm being watched, that the whispers are still out there, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I hear them again, faint but unmistakable, calling to me from the darkness, and I wonder how long I can resist before I'm drawn back to that place, before the whispers pull me in for good.